Separation is one of the most misunderstood tools God uses because it often feels like loss before it feels like purpose. When God begins to distance the chosen from certain people, environments, or routines, it can feel confusing and even painful. Many assume that separation means something is wrong, that they have failed, or that God is displeased. But in reality, separation is often a sign of promotion. God removes what can no longer go where He is taking you. The chosen come to understand that not everyone who started the journey with them is meant to finish it with them. Some people are assigned to a season, not a lifetime. God allows certain connections for growth, learning, or support. But when that purpose is fulfilled, He begins to shift the alignment. Holding on to what God is releasing can delay destiny. Separation is not cruelty, it is clarity. God separates to protect what He is developing. When purpose begins to mature, it becomes sensitive to influence. The wrong voices, habits, or environments can contaminate what God is building. That is why He often creates distance before He reveals the next level. The chosen may not fully understand the reason at first, but they sense that staying where they are would eventually cost them obedience. This separation can be internal before it becomes external. The chosen may still be physically present, but spiritually detached. Conversations no longer feed them. Activities that once felt fulfilling now feel empty. This is not arrogance or judgment, it is discernment. God is changing their appetite because He is changing their assignment. What once satisfied them can no longer sustain them. To others, this process may look like isolation. Friends may question why the chosen are pulling back. Family may misunderstand the distance. But God is not isolating, He is repositioning. Isolation is absence of connection. Separation is intentional placement. God often pulls the chosen into quiet seasons so He can speak without interruption and prepare them without pressure. Separation also exposes dependency. When familiar support systems are removed, the chosen are forced to rely more fully on God. This is uncomfortable because it reveals areas where trust was placed in people instead of God. But this dependency shift is necessary. God will not allow the chosen to lean on what cannot sustain them in the next season. He wants to be the source, not the supplement. There are moments when separation feels unfair, especially when it involves people who have been loyal or loving. But God's decisions are not always emotional, they are strategic. He sees what the chosen cannot see. He knows which relationships will hinder growth, dilute focus, or compromise obedience. Removing access is sometimes the only way to preserve calling. The chosen also learn that separation refines character. Walking alone exposes motives, fears, and insecurities that were hidden in crowds. Without constant affirmation, they learn to stand on conviction. Without constant companionship, they learn to hear God clearly. This process strengthens spiritual maturity and emotional stability. Separation is not permanent unless it needs to be. Some seasons require distance for growth, not disconnection forever. But the chosen learn not to rush reunions God has not authorized. Reconnecting too soon can undo the work God has done in private. Timing matters just as much as obedience. Ultimately, separation positions the chosen for alignment. When God removes what is misaligned, he makes room for what is divinely connected. New relationships, new environments, and new opportunities appear not as replacements, but as reinforcements. What feels like loss in one season becomes leverage in the next. God never separates without intention, and he never positions without purpose. Discomfort and restlessness are often mistaken for dissatisfaction or impatience, but in the spiritual realm, they frequently signal transition. When God begins to shift a person into a new season, he rarely does it without first disturbing their comfort. The chosen experience this disturbance deeply because their spirits are sensitive to divine movement. What once felt stable begins to feel restrictive. What once brought peace now produces unease. This is not confusion. It is God alerting the soul that it is time to move. Restlessness is God's way of breaking attachment to what has expired. If everything remained comfortable, there would be no motivation to leave. God allows inner tension so the chosen do not settle permanently in places meant to be temporary. This restlessness is not anxiety driven by fear. It is a holy dissatisfaction that whispers, there is more. It pushes the chosen to seek, pray, and listen more intently. Many try to silence this feeling by changing external circumstances. Instead of discerning the internal message, they distract themselves, overwork, or seek comfort in familiar habits. But the restlessness remains because it is not rooted in environment alone. It is rooted in purpose. God is not asking for adjustment. He is calling for transition. Until the chosen respond, the discomfort continues. This inner stirring often arrives before visible change. God speaks to the spirit long before the situation shifts. The chosen may still be in the same job, the same relationships, or the same routines, yet something inside them has already moved. This creates tension between where they are and where they are being called. It feels uncomfortable because alignment has shifted internally while the external reality lags behind. Discomfort also exposes stagnation. God does not allow the chosen to remain spiritually idle. When growth stops, discomfort begins. It is not punishment, it is prompting. God uses unease to highlight areas where obedience has been delayed or where purpose has been outgrown. The chosen recognize that peace is not always found in staying. Sometimes peace is found in obeying. There are moments when restlessness increases without clear instruction. This can be unsettling, but it is part of the preparation. God is loosening emotional ties and mental dependencies before he gives the next directive. If he revealed the next step too early, the chosen might rush ahead without full readiness. The discomfort builds capacity, strengthening faith and resilience for what is coming. Transition seasons are marked by internal shifts before external doors open. This is why the chosen often feel like they are in between, no longer comfortable where they are, but not yet established where they are going. This in-between space can feel lonely and uncertain, but it is necessary. It is where identity is refined and reliance on God deepens. Discomfort also clarifies values. As restlessness grows, the chosen become more aware of what no longer aligns with their calling. Conversations feel shallow. Environments feel draining. Compromises feel heavier. This clarity is essential because transition requires discernment. God sharpens sensitivity so the chosen do not carry unnecessary baggage into the next season. Some mistake this restlessness as a sign to quit prematurely or act impulsively. But the chosen learn to pair discomfort with discernment. They do not move out of emotion, they move out of obedience. Restlessness signals readiness, not recklessness. It calls for prayer, not panic. In time, when the chosen responds to God's prompting, the discomfort gives way to peace, not because everything is easy, but because alignment has been restored. What once felt unsettling now feels purposeful. The restlessness was not meant to torment, it was meant to transition. God's direction is not released to everyone in the same way because not everyone is positioned to carry it. When God speaks, there are layers in his voice. Some people hear sound, others hear meaning, but the chosen hear assignment. That is why the same message can leave one person inspired and another person unchanged. It is not that God is selective in love, but he is intentional in purpose. He knows who has the capacity to obey what he reveals. The chosen recognize that God's voice does more than comfort, it confronts. It does not simply make them feel better, it calls them higher. When God gives direction to the chosen, it often interrupts their routine, challenges their assumptions, and exposes areas they have ignored. This is why many people resist divine instruction. They enjoy encouragement, but they avoid correction. The chosen understand that correction is not rejection, it is evidence of trust. God's direction comes with weight. It carries responsibility, accountability, and expectation. That is why it cannot be given to everyone. Some people want revelation without obligation. They want insight without change. They want promises without process. But the chosen know that every instruction from God demands movement. It demands a decision. It demands alignment. When God speaks to them, they understand that remaining the same is no longer an option. There is also a difference between hearing God and listening to God. Many hear, but few listen. Listening requires surrender. Listening requires the humility to admit that God knows more than personal experience, more than logic, more than fear. The chosen listen because they trust the source of the voice. They don't argue with conviction. They don't delay obedience to seek approval. They don't silence God to protect comfort. Often, God's direction to the chosen is deeply personal. It is not something that can be easily shared or explained. Others may hear it and misunderstand it. Others may question it or even mock it. That is why God does not broadcast certain instructions publicly. He whispers them to those whose spirits are trained to hear him. The chosen learn how to guard what God speaks because they know that not everyone can steward sacred information. God also knows that direction shapes destiny. One instruction followed at the right time can change the course of a life. That is why he entrusts his direction to those who are willing to act on it, even when it costs them something. The chosen understand that obedience is not passive, it is active trust. It is stepping forward before certainty arrives. It is letting go before replacement appears. There are moments when God's direction feels uncomfortable because it separates the chosen from what is familiar. It may require distancing from relationships, habits, or environments that once felt safe. To others, This separation looks unnecessary or extreme, but the chosen recognize that God is not isolating them. He is refining them. He is removing distractions so that his voice becomes clearer and his purpose becomes sharper. The chosen also learn that God's direction often comes quietly. It may not arrive with dramatic signs or external confirmation. Sometimes it comes as a persistent inner knowing, a repeated conviction, a holy dissatisfaction that refuses to fade. Those who are not chosen for that instruction will ignore it or explain it away. But the chosen feel it deeply because their spirits are sensitive to divine movement. This is why God's direction cannot be forced on everyone. It requires spiritual readiness. It requires maturity. It requires the willingness to be misunderstood. The chosen do not listen because they are perfect, but because they are available. They have positioned their hearts to hear and their minds to receive and their lives to respond. When God speaks, they listen because they know that his direction is not random. It is intentional, timely, and transformative. Obedience to God has always carried a cost, and the chosen understand this even when they wish it were not true. Following divine direction often demands sacrifices that are invisible to others but deeply personal to the one obeying. It may require letting go of comfort, releasing control, or walking away from what feels familiar and safe. These sacrifices can feel heavy, especially when there is no immediate reward in sight. Yet the chosen recognize that obedience is never wasted, even when it is costly. One of the greatest costs of obedience is misunderstanding. When the chosen follow God's direction, their decisions may not make sense to others. Friends may question their choices. Family may express concern. Observers may label obedience as foolishness. This misunderstanding can create emotional distance and loneliness. But the chosen learn that approval from people cannot be valued above alignment with God. They accept that being understood is not a requirement for obedience. Obedience can also cost relationships. Some connections are built around shared seasons, shared habits, or shared limitations. When God calls the chosen higher, those relationships may no longer fit. This does not mean there is bitterness or hatred, but there is distance. Letting go of people who once mattered deeply can be painful, yet the chosen trust that God removes what cannot accompany them into their future. They learn that holding on out of sentiment can delay destiny. Comfort is another common sacrifice. Obedience often disrupts routines and challenges preferences. God may ask the chosen to serve when they would rather rest, to give when resources feel tight, or to remain faithful when circumstances are discouraging. Comfort resists change, but calling demands growth. The chosen understand that ease is not the measure of rightness. Sometimes the hardest path is the most aligned one. There are seasons when obedience seems to cost progress. Instead of producing it, doors close, opportunities disappear, resources feel limited. In these moments, obedience tests faith at its deepest level. The chosen must believe that God sees beyond the present loss. They trust that what looks like delay is often divine redirection. God may be clearing paths that would have led them away from their true assignment. Obedience also costs ego. It requires humility to follow God's direction when it contradicts personal plans or public expectations. The chosen surrender the need to prove themselves. They stop chasing validation and start seeking alignment. This surrender is not weakness, it is strength. It frees them from the burden of performing for approval and anchors them in purpose. While obedience costs much, it always leads to destiny. Destiny is not merely a place or position, it is alignment with God's will. The chosen understand that purpose is worth more than popularity and calling is worth more than comfort. They may lose temporary things, but they gain eternal significance. What obedience removes is often what would have restricted growth later. God honors obedience with trust. When the chosen obey in small, difficult matters, God entrusts them with greater responsibility. Their capacity increases. Their discernment sharpens. Their spiritual authority deepens. Destiny unfolds not as a sudden reward, but as a series of doors opened through faithfulness. The chosen also learn that obedience produces peace, even when circumstances remain challenging. This peace does not come from ease, but from knowing they are aligned. They may grieve what was lost, but they do not regret obedience. In time, they see how every sacrifice served a purpose, how every loss made room for something greater, and how obedience, though costly, was the pathway that led them exactly where they were meant to be. God often speaks in a way that stretches faith before it satisfies understanding. He gives direction before he gives details, because faith that depends on full explanation is not faith at all. The chosen learn early that God is not obligated to reveal the entire plan before he asks for obedience. In fact, if he did, obedience would become calculation instead of trust. Direction comes first because it reveals the posture of the heart. When God says move, release, begin, or end something, the instruction is rarely accompanied by full clarity. There is often no timeline, no visible outcome, and no reassurance beyond his voice. This is where many hesitate. They want to know how it will work, who will support them, and what the final result will look like. But the chosen understand that obedience is not a negotiation, it is a response. God speaks and faith answers with action, not questions. Explanation has a way of feeding control, and God is not interested in sharing control of the process. He wants trust, not management. If he explained everything up front, fear would not be challenged and dependence would not be developed. By giving direction first, God invites the chosen into relationship rather than information. They learn to walk with him, not ahead of him and not behind him. The chosen also learn that clarity often comes after movement. God reveals the next step once the current step is taken. This requires patience and courage, because standing still feels safer than stepping into the unknown. But God does not bless hesitation. He blesses obedience. Each act of obedience sharpens spiritual vision, making the next instruction clearer than the last. There are seasons when God's direction seems to contradict logic. He may ask someone to leave security without showing provision, to forgive without apology, to serve without recognition, or to wait without explanation. To the natural mind, these instructions feel unreasonable, but the chosen trust that God operates beyond human logic. They understand that what looks risky in the natural is often strategic in the spiritual. Explanation can also become a crutch. People delay obedience by claiming they are waiting on God, when in reality, God is waiting on them. The chosen discern the difference between wisdom and fear. They recognize when delay is disguised as discernment. When God has spoken clearly, they move even if their emotions are still catching up to their faith. God gives direction before explanation to purify motive. When there is no visible reward attached, obedience becomes an act of devotion rather than expectation. The chosen follow God because they trust Him, not because they see immediate benefit. This kind of obedience deepens intimacy with God and strengthens spiritual authority. It proves that their relationship with Him is not transactional. As obedience is exercised, explanation begins to unfold. Sometimes it comes through experience, sometimes through confirmation, and sometimes through results that only make sense in hindsight. The chosen often look back and realize that what once confused them was actually protecting them, preparing them, or positioning them. God was working behind the scenes while they were simply following instructions. This process builds resilience. When explanation is delayed, faith grows muscles. The chosen become less dependent on reassurance and more grounded in trust. They stop panicking when answers don't arrive immediately. They learn that God's silence does not mean absence, and lack of explanation does not mean lack of purpose. By giving direction first, God teaches the chosen how to walk by faith and not by sight. He trains them to recognize His voice above uncertainty and to move forward without needing everything to make sense. In time, they discover that obedience itself opens doors that explanation never could. Walking in God's direction requires more than faith alone. It requires spiritual maturity expressed through silence, discernment, and courage. The chosen quickly learn that not every instruction from God is meant to be shared. Silence is not secrecy rooted in fear, but wisdom rooted in understanding. God often works best in hidden places where His plans are protected from premature exposure and unnecessary interference. The chosen learn to be quiet, not because they lack confidence, but because they respect the process. Silence guards vision. When God places something sacred in the heart, it becomes vulnerable to outside opinions. Well, meaning voices can introduce doubt, fear, or confusion. Some people speak from experience rather than revelation, and their advice, though sincere, can derail obedience. The chosen understand that explaining God's instruction to those who cannot discern it may weaken resolve. Silence preserves clarity and keeps focus intact. Discernment is equally essential because not every voice that sounds spiritual carries divine authority. The chosen learn to distinguish between God's voice and the noise of emotion, culture, or personal desire. Discernment is developed through intimacy with God, not through information alone. The more time the chosen spend listening, the clearer His voice becomes. This sensitivity allows them to recognize when guidance aligns with God's character and timing. Discernment also involves recognizing when to move and when to wait. Courage is not always loud action. Sometimes it is patient restraint. The chosen resist pressure to act prematurely just to prove faith. They understand that obedience includes timing. Moving too early can be just as damaging as moving too late. Courage gives them the strength to wait when waiting is required, and to act when action is demanded. Courage becomes critical when God's direction goes against popular opinion. Obedience often requires standing alone, making decisions that are unpopular, or refusing paths that appear successful by worldly standards. The chosen face fear, doubt, and resistance, but they move forward anyway. Courage does not eliminate fear. It empowers obedience despite fear. It is the resolve to trust God's voice above all others. Silence, discernment, and courage work together. Silence creates space to hear God clearly. Discernment ensures that what is heard is rightly understood. Courage turns understanding into action. Without silence, the chosen become distracted. Without discernment, they become deceived. Without courage, they become stagnant. God requires all three for those he entrusts with direction. There are seasons when courage means saying no to opportunities that look good but are not God. The chosen understand that not every open door is a divine door. Discernment allows them to evaluate opportunity through purpose rather than pressure. Courage empowers them to walk away from what is good in order to pursue what is God ordained. Silence also strengthens inner confidence. When the chosen stop seeking constant validation, they become grounded in conviction. They no longer need applause to confirm obedience. This inner stability is essential for longevity in calling. God is preparing them to carry responsibility, not just blessings. In moments of opposition or misunderstanding, silence becomes a shield. The chosen do not feel the need to defend every decision or explain every move. They trust that obedience will speak for itself in time. Courage allows them to remain steady when questioned, criticized, or doubted. Ultimately, God develops silence, discernment, and courage so the chosen can move with precision. Direction from God is powerful, but it must be handled wisely. The chosen are not reckless followers. They are disciplined listeners. They hear clearly, judge wisely, and move boldly, confident that obedience rooted in God's voice will always lead them forward.